You're listening to Spurscast, episode 601. My name is Paul Garcia, and I'm your host here on the Spurscast. Today, I'll be joined by Project Spurs writer Steven Anderson. In this episode, Steven and I will discuss the Spurs' final 4 games before All-Star break, trade chatter involving their veteran players, and the bench depth Luka Samanic, Trey Lyles, and Keita Bates-Diop have provided with multiple rotation players being out. Let's go ahead and jump right into this episode. Steven, how are you doing?
Hey, Paul, man, how's it going? Man, I'm doing well. Surviving this Corona season and, enjoying this Spurs season so far. How are you?
I'm doing well as well. Just buckle down, just kind of, like you mentioned, trying to avoid the virus and everything, hopefully getting back to normal soon with all the vaccinations going out and everything like that. Mm-hmm. And then also the Spurs, about to start up here the second half of the season. So let's go ahead and jump right into this episode. Where I left off last week. At that point, the Spurs had only played 1 game since, returning from quarantine against the Oklahoma City Thunder. I had discussed with Michael DeLeon. So now they've actually played 4 games this past week. They went 2-2 in these games. So let's do a quick little summary of how they performed since I recorded last Spurscast. So they got a 3-point win against the Pelicans recently this past week, or maybe it was last week. Anyway, DeMar DeRozan made his return to the team, so he participated in that game. Then they had a loss by 11, but in overtime to the Brooklyn Nets, where it looked like the Spurs were out of it. They make a quick little comeback there, like in the final minute, and DeJounte Murray sends them to overtime. But the Nets pulled away there in the overtime period, and they won by 11. Kyrie Irving and James Harden both played in that game. Kevin Durant was out, and of course we know the Spurs have been without multiple rotation players since returning from quarantine. Then they had their biggest win of the season, the following night on the second night of a back-to-back. They beat the New York Knicks by 26 points, and that was important because, like I mentioned, it's their first win on the second night of a back-to-back. And also the Knicks came in with a really good reputation here. They were the second best, or as of right now, they're the second best defensive team as you and I record this on Saturday. So that was a big win for the Spurs. And then their last game before the All-Star break was a loss to the Oklahoma City Thunder by 5. There's 2 ways to look at it, because this is one of those games where this could be one of those games that they look back on if they're really struggling to get into the playoffs, or if a certain seed goes to another team because of this loss. And the reason why I say that is because this is a game where the Spurs were favored by 7. The Thunder were missing multiple players. They led by 14, San Antonio, so they had a pretty comfortable lead there. They just couldn't push it forward. And then of course OKC was actually on the second out of a back-to-back, and we know that this was one of those uncharacteristic type losses because the Spurs had 19 turnovers. And immediately when the game was over, I felt like, wow, that they really gave that one away. This could be a game that haunts them. But then when you go back and you look at and you listen to Greg Popovich's post game quotes, he actually says he felt like they were kind of due that kind of performance. The fact that they're playing with multiple players out. They just got back from out of quarantine, and and it was a tough stretch for them in that week. So he kind of felt like this is an uncharacteristic type of loss for them, but it can happen. So listening to Coach Pop, there was more optimism in his post game comments. So overall, Steven, at the pause of the season, the Spurs are 18-14. Out west, where they are placed 7th out west in the standings. They are 20th on offense and 9th on defense. And then the last note of this past week was that Conan Johnson was named to the 2021 Rising Stars roster, even though there's not going to be an actual game played. So go ahead and take this this conversation wherever you want, whatever topic that you want to touch on.
All right, well, I'm going to go just touch on these 4 games. First of all, I agree. I think they should have been 3-1 in these 4 games. The win against the Pelicans, DeMar, obviously, as you noted, he did return in that game after, obviously, not only the guys being out because of the COVID protocol, but also his father passing away. And obviously, Pop gave him a game and obviously at that time to be with his family, understandably so. And he came back and he played amazing. I mean, after everything that he went through, he played very, very well. The Spurs got the win over the Pelicans, as you noted. That next game against Brooklyn, I give them that loss. I honestly did not think it was going to be as close as it was. I mean, and it wasn't. If you look at the final score, I mean, they lost by 11 in overtime. But they were down in that game by double digits in the second half, I should note, in double digits. And when you got James Harden, DeAndre Jordan, Kyrie Irving on one team, and you look at the Spurs team, there's a very young team. It probably should have never been that close looking on paper. But I think this game against Brooklyn, or that game against Brooklyn, kind of showed what this team is really made of. And I think we knew that the whole season. Like we knew, Paul, we talked about it multiple times on Twitter. I've said on this podcast as well, that this team is not the same team from last year. This is a team that is a lot younger. They're more determined. They're more aggressive. They're not as quote unquote scared to take the big shots anymore. And we saw that against Brooklyn. I mean, they came back, they rallied, they used a 10-0 run in that final, I think 2.5, 3 minutes to come back and force overtime. Obviously, they ran out of gas in overtime and they lost, but it just shows the kind of heart this team has. I'm not really going to touch on the Knicks too much, but I mean, as you noted, it was a night of a back-to-back, their biggest margin, win by margin of the season, and then against New York, which surprisingly has the second best defense in the NBA. So, I mean, that overall, after losing the way they lost to the Nets the night before, I kind of just feel like, okay, well, going against the Knicks now, you know, they kind of know what they did wrong the night before and did not make those same mistakes on the following night. Now, going to that loss against the Thunder, I agree with you. I think that if the Spurs somehow manage to miss the playoffs, and looking at the second half of the season, it is very possible they could miss the playoffs because they are stacked with games. I believe you can check me on this. I think it's 40 games in like 65 days or something like that.
40 games in 68 days.
68 days. Okay. Well, it's a very heavy schedule. They don't have any multiple days off. They have back-to-backs. They have games every other day. Pop did mention that, you know, after the game against the Thunder, as you noted, that it's good. These games are going. He expected this to happen. You know, the guys are tired. You know, this was probably going to happen. 19 turnovers, very uncharacteristic for the Spurs team. They were favored by 7, as you noted. They did lead by 14 points, and OKC came back to win the game. This will be one of those games I look back on if they miss the playoffs and be like, well, what if that didn't happen? Especially if they miss it by a game or two. And look back and like, what if they would have won this game or that game? But Paul, this is what worries me going into the second half of the season is, okay, let me just note, and you've noted this as well, that they did not have all their players. Derek White was not available. You know, Devin Vassell, Rudy Gay, they were not there because of COVID protocol. But when they do return, I'm going to wonder, can this team handle this heavy schedule in the back half of the season? Patty Mills said after the game on Thursday, you know, it was a brutal schedule this first half of the season. And to quote him now, quote, it's going to get much, much worse in the second half of the season. And they know what's coming. My question is, and I'm not talking about like DeMar, Lamarcus, Patty. I'm talking about the young players who have never been playing this much, who have never really gone through a schedule like this. Can they handle it? And I think that's going to be the biggest thing of the season going in the second half. Can our young core, or can the Spurs young core really handle this grueling schedule that they're about to go through?
Yeah, no, for sure. And actually, I'm glad you mentioned that they could have pretty much gone 3-1. We could actually both argue they could have gone 4-0 as well, because even that Thunder game was, you know, in the final minute, the Spurs were still down by just 2 possessions. And I have a stat here where I track throughout the season. If it's a 2-possession game within the final minute, I track whether the Spurs could have won or lost, you know. And so at best, you know, let's just say they won all their close games, they could be 26-6, you know, and at worst 8-24. So you're right. I mean, the good thing is that this team in all these 4 games, despite missing, you know, multiple rotation players like you mentioned there, they're always competitive. They're right in the thick of these games. And so I think that's a really good question you asked right now is you know, how will the younger players perform in this second half of the season with this grueling schedule? Because like Patty said, you know, it's the fact that there's so many games that the competition and some of these games are going to get a lot tougher for them. Some of the teams are going to face the fact that there's not that many days off in between. There's actually no consecutive off days. Like you don't get 2 days off in a row. And so that's hard part of it. But then the other part is just that mental factor. What Patty mentioned was the fact that you're always worrying about, oh, wait a minute, is somebody going to catch COVID? And then, you know, or are you going to, you know, are you going to get placed in health and safety protocols, which just throws off your rhythm, you know, gets different players out of the rotation, you know who's coming back. And so I think that's the biggest factor. It's like a mental hurdle as well as a physical hurdle in terms of this second half of the season. So yeah, I think that's a really good question. And when we get to our last topic today, I think that there's some optimism there because of the players that we're going to discuss who might help out in that department, which is some of those younger players at the end of the bench. All right, Steven. So and then also like we both mentioned, you know, Conan Johnson. I think that wasn't like too surprising, just because Keldon's had a great year for the Spurs. You know, he's been a really good player for them. And unfortunately, you know, we couldn't watch him in any type of game because there was no game. Just because the NBA was being cautious.
Just to touch on that real fast.
Go ahead.
You know, obviously Keldon has played amazing this season. I think all of us knew, all of us writers, everyone in the media, I think we knew Keldon was something special in the bubble. But I don't think any of us thought that he would be this type of player this quickly for the Spurs. And that Rising Stars game, well, not game, but the Rising Stars team honor is well deserved. I will say it is very unfortunate that COVID is still going on at the moment, and we don't get to see him play, because I would love to see him play against some of the best second-year players in the NBA right now.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Getting up and down the court with with his ability to run the break, I mean, that would have been a lot of fun. So, yeah, we'll see. All right, so let's go into right into our second topic here, and this is some trade chatter, some trade rumors. On Thursday, Shams Charania of The Athletic reported this quote in his story. He wrote, "The Spurs are receiving calls on their veteran players who are pending free agents, Lamarcus Aldridge, DeMar DeRozan, Rudy Gay, Trey Lyles, and Patty Mills, and are listening to inquiries," sources said. So this is not too surprising. This is something that was reported before the season even began, the fact that the Spurs were going to be taking calls on their veteran players, because why? I mean, it makes sense. We knew they were going into a more, not a rebuilding year, but more of a route of development where they wanted to give a lot of their younger players like Keldon, DeJounte, Derek White, all those players, etc., some minutes. Even Devin Vassell, we didn't see what was going to happen, but he ended up becoming a rotation player. So we know that they were going to give these younger players some minutes, and now this really hasn't changed. It's not showing. Colin Reed did a mini podcast on this series about this rumor, and he pretty much summarized it very well. Where he said that the Spurs aren't the ones actively making the calls. They're not trying to get rid of these players. They're not calling these teams. They're just saying he's just saying that Brian Wright, that the GM, is taking phone calls here. Is what we assume here from this reporting, that teams are calling the Spurs and say, hey, what would you take for maybe one of these veteran players, because they know they're in the last year of their deal, and some of these players, maybe a year or two more, maybe they could extend with the Spurs, but right now, all of them we could just see very, very realistically all these players end up leaving in this offseason. So let's first talk about the salaries and where they stand. So DeMar DeRozan, we know, is the highest paid of these players at $27.7 million. Then you have Lamarcus Aldridge right behind him at $24 million. And it's important to keep in mind when you discuss trade rumors with the Spurs is that Aldridge has a 15% trade kicker, so that increases the salary a little bit more when you want to move him to another team. Rudy Gay's next at $14.5 million, Patty Mills at $13.5 million, and then Trey Lyles at $5.5 million. So, we're not going to get into any kind of who's calling or anything like that. I don't want to go into those kind of conversations. There's been no reporting on that. Right. But I do want to ask you, Stephen, now that we know exactly where the Spurs are, they're seventh out west. They're a very competitive team. We know that the veterans that they really rely on are, DeRozan for sure. He's incremental for their team. He pretty much could have been an all-star this year. It's just that he kept getting passed up. Rudy Gay's been incremental for this team off the bench. Patty Mills as well. Now, Aldridge, we know, has been in a rough place where he couldn't figure it out with the starting group. Then he got hurt. He's had some different type of injuries, and lately he was bothered this past week with a stomach illness. And so Coach Pop has brought him off the bench for a few games, and it looks like that's going to be his role for now. I mean, unless there's any more positivity in his production when he plays, it looks like he's pretty much coming off the bench at this point. And then we know Trey Lyles. When everyone's healthy, Trey Lyles is not part of this rotation. He's kind of sitting there waiting in that third group of bench players. But we saw that with players hurt or on the injured list, like we did this past 2 weeks, Trey Lyles ended up getting a lot of minutes, which we're going to discuss a little bit. So here's what I want to ask you, Stephen. Would you rank? What are your rankings in terms of the chance, the high percentage that a player gets moved, and to the lowest percentage that any of these five veterans get moved? So if you could give us your list.
Okay, well, before I do that, let me just say, Paul, I've had a lot of tweets from Spurs fans, in my mentions, they're saying oh, the Spurs are going to do this, they should do this. Oh, they're really trying to get rid of Patty Mills, blah, blah, blah. I want, and I'm sure, and you know this, I know this, but I just want to make it clear, the NBA is a business. Hearing calls and taking calls is all part of it. It does not mean the Spurs are going to make a move. It does not mean that Patty Mills is on the trade block. It's just a normal thing that every team does, and does not mean anything. So I just want to make that very clear, number one. To answer your question, first of all, I do play NBA 2K, and I know you do as well. I do have Lamarcus coming off the bench in NBA 2K, and it's working fabulously. But to answer your question, I think the most likely to be traded is Lamarcus Aldridge because of everything you had mentioned. He's having a hard time finding his groove, and he has had a hard time finding his groove, not just this season, Paul, but seasons past. There was rumors, obviously, and you know this, he wanted to be traded before Pop had a talk with him. All these type of, he's in trade rumors every year since he's been in San Antonio. But this season feels different, and this is why. Because he has not been able to find his footing. Yes, I understand he's had the stomach illness recently. He was hurt with the sore hip. But even before that, he just never really found his footing. You watch these guys very carefully as much as I do, and Lamarcus does not seem the type of player that wants to change. And what I mean by that is pull up from three, be that guy on the perimeter. He wants to stick in the post. He wants to get the ball down low like the traditional power forward does back in the day. And he's a veteran. He's not going to want to change his style at this time in his career. With that being said, him moving to the bench, I think, has been beneficial to the Spurs and to the bench unit. Because Jakob Poeltl in the starting lineup has been a phenomenal change. He's played amazing. He's gone up to the boards. He's been aggressive on both ends of the court. That's something I think Pop has been looking for since probably David Robinson retired. Comparing him to David Robinson, maybe a little bit of a stretch, but I mean, Jakob is a very decent young center that I think has a very big future in San Antonio, and hence why he got his contract over the offseason. So I think Lamarcus is most likely the one to watch to be traded. Trey Lyles probably number 2, only because he had a starting role a year ago. And then obviously things kind of went south in the bubble for him. And then this season he's been reduced to garbage time minutes, and obviously not recently because of the holes in the team right now because of COVID protocol and things like that. But I think those two are the most likely. I think the least likely is DeMar. I say that because I've said this multiple times to you and to everybody listening that I think DeMar has a future in San Antonio beyond this season because I think he fits very well with this young group that the Spurs are building right now. I mean, you notice he plays well with DeJounte Murray. He plays well with Keldon Johnson and Jakob and all the starting unit. He plays very well with them. I think they complement his game very nicely. He doesn't have to always be the one, as we saw when he was in Toronto, him and Kyle Lowry doing most of the heavy lifting offensively. This time, DeRozan has those key pieces around him. So I mean, I'm not saying he's going to stay. I know it's going to be up to him when this season is over, unless the Spurs can get him an extension or something along those lines. But we'll see what happens with that. Patty Mills, I would be very, very, very surprised if he left because Pop has said multiple times that Patty is the backbone of this team in the locker room, that he's a very vocal figure in the locker room. He's seen as the quote-unquote leader in the locker room. So I don't think the Spurs would want to get rid of that kind of morale in the locker room in the middle of the season, and particularly when you're fighting for a playoff spot. And the same thing with Rudy Gay. Rudy's had some struggles here and there this season, but more than recently, he has picked it up. Obviously, COVID, we haven't seen him, but I mean, recently he has picked it up. So I think, to answer your question, my main two to watch would be Lamarcus and Trey Lyles. But as you noted, the 50% trade kicker will make it a lot harder for him to be traded, I think. So that's why I feel he may not be traded at all, only because of that reason.
Yeah, I'm with you. My list is pretty much the same. It's if the most likely players I think in order are Aldridge, then Trey Lyles, then Rudy Gay, then Mills, then DeRozan. And I really feel like I would be shocked if Gay, Mills, and DeRozan, either of those players, got moved this season, only because of like we mentioned, they're pretty much part of this team. They're part of the core. Now Rudy's the interesting case for me, just because of how well Luka Samanic has been playing lately. With Rudy out, he's gotten a lot of minutes there at the 4, and so the only way I could see Rudy getting moved is if the team really felt like, hey, let's just give Luka these minutes now. Let's see what he can do for the second half of the season. That would be the only case where I see them moving Rudy. But again, I agree with you. I just don't think they're going to move any of those 3 players because they're so integral to the team. Now, Trey Lyles, his salary is more movable, $5.5 million. Just depends on which team has more interest in him and what those teams would be willing to give up for him, because the Spurs still want to keep Lyles as an option, in case somebody gets hurt or somebody has to sit out a game or 2. So that's why, just keeping Lyles for the rest of the season makes sense. Now, Aldridge is the reason why I don't see, even though I think he's the most likely to be traded in terms of the capability, I just don't see it just because of the financial part of it. Like you mentioned, Steven, his salary is a lot of money to move at $24 million, 15% trade kicker, like we mentioned there, and the teams that it's just hard to make a deal like that to get, because then the Spurs will be having to take back multiple players unless it's into a trade exception. But also the fact that there's like, Aldridge just isn't playing well. So how do other teams want him? They can maybe say, yeah, based on his past work in past seasons, but they can't show that right now. There's no tape of that because, he just hasn't had those kind of performances anymore. Like, the vintage Lamarcus. I know he's maybe had like 1 or 2 20-point games this season. And then also just the issues on defense, which is why he's coming off the bench now. It's the fact that their defense just suffers so much when he's on the floor. And so they have to have Jakob in there starting. And even like DeMar's numbers just got so much better when Lamarcus is off the floor. So that's the other part too, is that, as terms of what other teams scouts can see from him. It's just not showing right now, and where he's at this part of his career. So now this is a new interesting question, because this is something that just made me think about what happened recently with Blake Griffin. And here's the thing: is we just saw that Blake Griffin on the Pistons, he had 2 years left on his deal, and the Pistons really at this point they could not find a deal to move him. Nobody's going to take his contract at the amount it was, and it was even more than Lamarcus. So what they ended up doing was they actually just bought out Blake Griffin's contract, where he had to give back some money, and basically he's now a free agent. And the reporting is that he's going to sign with the Brooklyn Nets. So I do wonder if Lamarcus is not happy with this bench role. Before I know that if the Spurs can't find a trade, team on the 25th, if they are trying to move him, and again, this is all if. We're not saying that this is happening. This is just all if scenarios. So let's just say that up until the 25th of March, that's the trade deadline, if the Spurs can't find a taker for Lamarcus, let's just say they are trying to move him. Well, then I do wonder if before that, I couldn't find the new date for the buyout deadline. But anyway, there is that certain period after the trade deadline when a player can be bought out and then sign with the playoff team. So I do wonder if Lamarcus is not happy, with his role as coming off the bench, and maybe the team just doesn't want to give those minutes because it's affecting how Rudy plays and maybe Devin Vassell and some of the other players. I do wonder if maybe they'd explore the buyout option with Lamarcus, because basically you'd only be buying out part of his deal for this season, which is that $24 million, and maybe he'd give some of that money back just a little bit, just because it would allow him to become a free agent and look for different teams elsewhere. And the reason why I say that is because we have seen the Spurs do this with their veterans in the past. The most notable two players in recent years were Paul Gasol. When Pal was coming into one of those seasons where he was hampered by injuries, and then we just saw that he pretty much lost his place in the rotation. Mm-hmm. Well, then the Spurs bought him out so he could go sign with the team where he could play more, considering that he wasn't in the veteran stage of his career. And then this was also the case last year with DeMarre Carroll, where they signed Carroll in the offseason. They could never get him into the rotation because they liked the group that they had. There was just no minutes for him. So even though Carroll didn't make a big fuss out of it, in terms of publicly in the media or anything like that, but they wanted him to be able to play, and so they basically they bought him out as well, and then he was able to go sign with the Houston Rockets, and he finished out the season that way. So what do you think about that chance, Steven, if maybe they look at the buyout route if they can't find a trade team for Lamarcus Aldridge?
Well, the two instances you noticed there, or you noted, I should say, Paul, is first of all, the DeMarre Carroll situation and Lamarcus's are a little bit different because DeMarre Carroll didn't play at all. I mean, yeah. Lamarcus is playing, but the difference is with DeMarre Carroll and Paul Gasol, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think the Spurs are still paying Paul Gasol, are they not?
Yeah, they still have some money for this year. That's because they stretched his deal, I believe.
Okay, so that's what I'm saying.
Oh, no, it's Carroll they're still paying right now.
Oh, Carroll. Okay. I knew it was one. I wasn't sure which one. Okay. So, yeah. So, I'm not sure if the Spurs would go that route, mainly because would you want to still continue paying a player that's really not on your team anymore? But, of course, they're still doing that with DeMarre Carroll. But I will say this, and I know we're going to talk about the guys at the end of the bench here in just a moment, so I'll touch on it right now, which is I think it's going to depend on how Luka develops, because I think if Luka can develop at a faster rate and use the games that he has been playing these past couple as that experience. I think Pop has even mentioned he's happy with how he's coming along. I'm wondering if maybe that could be a reason why he's bought out. Now, of course, as well as I do, Lamarcus has vocally said in the past that he felt out of place and things like that in San Antonio. And I will say this, I will go on the record, I will throw myself at the mercy of Spurs Twitter here. I will say this, I've been a huge advocate for Lamarcus Aldridge when he first arrived in San Antonio. Even to my fellow friend, UIW alum, and current Spurs writer, Victoria Villarreal. I've talked to her about this, and she's not the biggest Lamarcus fan. I am, so we've had a little discussion about that. But now I see everyone's point, which is he just does not fit. So I'm thinking if Pop and the higher-ups see that and continue to see he's unhappy in this bench role, which he did note, I believe it was the game in OKC where he came off the bench for the first time since it was his rookie season. Yeah. And he had said, he didn't really come out and say he didn't like it, but he just said it's not something he's used to and he needs to get used to it. And again, that's going back to what I said earlier of him adapting and things like that. So I'm not really sure if that's something he wants to do. So it's going to depend on a lot of moving parts. I could see it happening, them buying him out. I'm just not sure how likely it is. I think it's just going to depend on a bunch of moving factors, but it would surprise me. It would surprise me if he stayed past March 25th, but then again, it also would not surprise me because depending if he plays well off the bench, I could see Pop just keeping him in that role for the rest of the season.
Yeah, so again, we're not reporting that he's unhappy with his bench role. We're just saying these are the three routes that the Spurs can take with Lamarcus to finish out this year. It's one, like Steven mentioned, he ends up liking his bench role, or maybe he even gets back into the starting lineup and he finishes out the season with the team. That's option one. Option two, he gets traded by March 25th, or option three, maybe he doesn't like his role and maybe he wants to go play elsewhere. He gets more of an opportunity. Well, then the Spurs could look at maybe buying him out if that's a route that they want to go down. And as far as the financial part of it, because he's in the last year of his deal, and whereas Carroll and also like Blake Griffin that we just mentioned earlier, and I think even Powell, they had more years left on their deal. That's why teams decided to stretch them out, and so their money carried over. So LaMarcus, they could just buy out the remaining part of his deal for this season, and as long as they don't stretch it that amount, then it doesn't have to go onto their books in the future. So again, those are just the three things that we want to explore again, just because those rumors did come out by Shams Charania, and it really, it's nothing new. It's just the same rumors that the Spurs are taking calls on their veteran players, but there's no activity that they're actually engaging in and maybe looking to move one of their players. But again, we basically have that you and I are recording this, Steve, 19 days now to the trade deadline, so we'll kind of monitor and see what happens with the Spurs. All right, so our last topic here is I want to discuss, Steven, the bench depth that some of these players that usually don't get minutes have been providing for the Spurs, and kind of showing that, in the case that the team gets impacted again by COVID, or somebody gets hurt, or somebody has to sit out multiple games, well, then they know that they can rely on some of these players to give them good production during these minutes that they get. And these are three players, Luka Samanic, Trey Lyles, and Keita Bates-Diop. And so the stats I'm going to provide first are for their last 5 games, and then I'll let you know, Spurscast listeners, if these are stats that some other stats are going to be for the whole season, because it's very limited data for these players. So again, most of these stats are for the last 5 games. So let's start off with Luka first. In these last 5 games that he's gotten more minutes, where he started one game and then he's come off the bench for the rest, he's averaging 7 points, grabbing 5.6 rebounds. He's shooting 35% from 3 on 3.4 attempts in 17.7 minutes. Coach Pop mentioned how since coming back from the bubble in Orlando, Luka's just been way more confident of a player, especially with his catch and shoot ability. On defense, we're starting to see a little bit of his versatility, where he's had matchups of Lou Dort as his primary matchup, a wing, Josh Hart and Tyler Johnson as guards that he's had to guard. Then we saw Julius Randle over the Knicks he had to defend, and then lastly Mike Muscala of the Thunder. So we've seen him basically pretty much go through almost all the different positions and show that he's a versatile, quick defender who moves laterally pretty well. As far as some other stats that stick out are he actually leads for the whole season. Again, it's only 99 total minutes for Luka. He leads the team in defensive field goal percentage at 37.5%, and he's showing to become a really good defensive rebounder when he's grabbing 8 defensive rebounds per 36 minutes, which is also a team high. So Steven, what do you want to say about Luka and what you've seen from him this past 2 weeks?
Yeah, Luka. First of all, I agree with Pop. I agree with everything you had said, which is, since the bubble and the G League have really, really helped him. I mean, I believe when he was drafted, we have those draft analysts on draft night. Some of them were comparing him to a Klay Thompson type of player, both offensively because of his 3-point shooting abilities and his defensive abilities. Didn't really see that, honestly, in the first season. But seeing him now, I see glimpses of that. And I mean, just look at you mentioned the players, Dort, Hart, Johnson, Randle, Muscala. We see him shooting 35% from 3. He's averaging 7 points, 5.6 rebounds. I mean, obviously in limited minutes, 17 minutes, but I mean, he's playing very well. I mean, I was pleasantly surprised. His shot looks very pure, very good. He's looking more confident, especially going up against some of these players like Dort and Randall. These are not rookies. These are very well established players. And so I mean, I think that he's played very, very well. And that's why I said earlier, depending on how Luka develops, does that mean Pop would trade away one of his veterans? Who knows? We don't know. But I mean, I think regardless of what happens this season, trade wise or veteran wise with the Spurs, I think Luka will more than likely, if he does go back to the G League, which I think might happen, and part of me thinks it should happen because it's been good for his development. But I do believe if he does go back, this probably will be his last season in the G League, I think.
Yeah, for sure. Two things or a few things that really stuck out to me were, you mentioned there, Stephen, if you watch that tape of him guarding Julius Randle, you'll notice that Randle really had to take a lot of like fading away shots. He couldn't get his positioning against Luka. One of the things that's really surprised me and just that I've really been watching is just his defense. When I plug in my numbers after each game, he's always just his stats are always just like, lighting up the board there against compared to his other fellow Spurs teammates. And I'm like, really, defensively, these numbers are just popping up. And I'm like, wow, okay. And then you watch the tape though, and you really watch him and just focus on him, and you see that his lateral quickness, how well he can just move at players, and he's not good about getting blocks or really having a commanding presence at the rim, but he's good about staying with his defender, and that's a good skill to have, and that's a very hard skill to have in the NBA. And so for the fact that he's able to do that pretty well, early on so far, in such limited minutes is a really good sign for his future and his defensive potential, and that's what's going to get him minutes down the road. Is if you're a good defensive player and you put a lot of energy into that end of the floor, you're going to get pops. You're going to get pops respect. You're going to get some minutes there. And then like you mentioned, Steve, one of the things that's really been impressive is just the fluidity with which he releases his jump shot on his 3-point shot. It's just so how do you say it? It's like a really quick shot. Mm-hmm. And then also his shot profile is really good. Is the fact is like he's either going to go inside and take shots near the paint, or he's going to shoot threes. He's not even wasting his time with mid range. So again, that's a good thing for his future. Now like you mentioned, that'll be something to watch with some of the veteran players who play at the 4. Is do they get moved? Trey Lyles, maybe a Rudy Gay, so that they can open up minutes for Luka now, or do they just wait and keep those players so that next year maybe that can become Luka's minutes? So I really feel like Rudy definitely, it looks like more likely that he probably wouldn't come back because they want to give next year. I'm talking about the offseason. Rudy wouldn't come back because they want to give Luka those primary minutes at the 4, whether it's starting or coming off the bench. Another player we mentioned here who's been playing well since multiple players have been out is Trey Lyles. Again, these are from the last 5 games only. He's averaging 12 points, 6.8 rebounds, 1 steal, 46% shooting from 3 on 4.4 attempts in 29 minutes. So he's getting a lot of minutes right now. And, he's pretty much been guarding your 4s, Zion Williamson, Julius Randle, et cetera, all the players that play the 4 for their different teams, Darius Bazley. Now, nothing's really stuck out to me from Trey. It's just that I really feel like he's playing well again to the point where he was a starting 4 last year. He's just playing really well and getting back to that level that he was at last year. What have you thought about Trey lately?
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, he's playing what we saw a season ago when he was a starter. He's pulling up from 3 well. He's hitting that 3 with confidence, 46%. He's averaging 12.2 points per game. That's hard to say. And I mean, overall, I think he's played very, very well. Like, I have no complaints about that. I do that. The only thing I would say is that we're seeing why Pop had him as a starter last season, because of what he's doing right now. Obviously, with guys like Jakob and Keldon Johnson emerging and guys like that, his minutes have been reduced. But these numbers, Paul, are a reason to keep him around past the trade deadline, past the buyout date, and all that. Because who knows what could happen in the playoffs or even in the second half of the season down the line.
Yeah, for sure. And so, just like you mentioned there, that's a good reason to keep him in case, something happens where they need to have an extra player. But then also, maybe he's become, other teams have said, hey, look at Trey Lyles. What if we get him, if we try to trade for him, and then maybe make him a part of the rotation. So there's also that, that thing as well. So again, we'll see what happens with Lyles. And he's been playing well lately, these last 5 games. And then also, the last player that's been playing well is Keita Bates-Diop. He's been coming off the bench here for the team, and he's averaging 5.8 points in the last 5 games, 3.2 rebounds, 1 assist, 1 steal, 50% shooting on 3 from 2 attempts per game in 16 minutes. So some things that really stick out to me in terms of some stats is the steals numbers. He's averaging 2 steals per 36 minutes, which if that was for a full season, that would be only behind Devin Vassell. And he's also, his numbers and deflections are actually pretty well. So again, that shows you that his off-ball activity is pretty well. And then I've also seen Pop go to him on certain matchups. He's really put him on players like Brandon Ingram, Zion Williamson, and RJ Barrett is some recent players. And so, just shows that Bates-Diop has been a really good defensive option there for the Spurs, playing more that 3-4 kind of role. What have you thought about his play?
Okay, I'll be 100% completely honest here. I forgot he was on the team for a while because he just wasn't playing. I was like, oh yeah, we have this guy here that I completely forgot existed for a minute. But I mean, in the time I've seen Bates-Diop play, he's done well for himself. I mean, Paul, correct me if I'm wrong. He used to be in Denver, correct?
Yeah, Denver and Minnesota. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, I remember seeing him. I was like, oh, yeah, he's on the Spurs now. So, I mean, yeah. So, whenever he was in Denver, Minnesota, I remember seeing him, and he would play well against the Spurs. Now he's on the Spurs, and obviously he's not getting the minutes that he got with those two teams. But I mean, he is playing well in the time that he has gotten. Defensively, I will note 2 steals, and then you said it yourself. He matched up against Zion. I mean, Zion of all people. I was going to say Mark Ingram, but that's football. Brandon Ingram, and so I mean, yes, I mean he's done well for himself, I will say. Now, does this mean he's going to get an increased role with the team? Probably not. But I mean, it's always good to have something like that in your back pocket in case you need it, right?
Yeah, for sure. And that was my last question, Stephen, was that, as well as all 3 of these players were playing, Luka Samanic, Trey Lyles, and Keita Bates-Diop, you don't think that, I don't think this, you don't think that they're going to replace any of those players who are out right now, right? Like Rudy, Derek White, or, what's his name? Devin Vassell. You don't think they're going to take any of their minutes, right? Pretty much.
I would be surprised. I mean, unless Rudy just completely stinks the bed when he comes back, or, Trey Lyles just happens to, get hurt, unfortunately, or something like that, then maybe. But I mean, I don't see it happening because Pop needs that veteran presence on the floor in crunch time and things like that. So I just don't see that happening now.
Yeah, so, as well as these players were playing, these last 2 weeks, and they really stepped up for the team, I think that Pop's going to go back to his normal rotation, his 10-man rotation that he had set in before the team was impacted by COVID. Obviously, something to watch, though, is, how do these players who had COVID, how do they play when they come back? Do they get back to can they get back to their full levels that they were playing at before? And I think that just this bench depth is something good for like we mentioned, for them going forward, the fact that they learned that, hey, we could put Luka and give him 15 minutes tonight. We could give Trey Lyles 20 minutes tonight, Bates-Diop, in case, again, with those, I think they have 11 back-to-backs during this next half of the season. So again, if that schedule, the second half gets really grueling, or if the team gets impacted by multiple players being out, well, then they have 3 extra players now that they can go to, and they know that they're going to give them some steady production on different areas of the floor in Luka, Trey, and Keita Bates-Diop. So again, that's something to watch, is the fact that the Spurs just pretty much discovered here that they got some extra bench depth in the event that some players need to be out for the second half of the year. And then, of course, to watch, especially with Trey Lyles for the trade deadline, in case other teams, try to trade for him. All right, so before we wrap up, don't forget to visit ProjectSpurs.com. Make sure you check out Steven's analysis after each game when the games do come back. Colin Reed, like I mentioned earlier, has his latest piece. It's a PS Project Spurs audio extra, the Spurs trade deadline preview part 1, that can be found here in the Spurscast feed, or if not, visit ProjectSpurs.com. John Diaz, Michael De Leon, and Jonas Clark recorded the Forever Turtles podcast episode 9. Again, you can find that here in the Spurscast feed, and then also on ProjectSpurs.com. And then lastly, Ben Bornstein's getting ready for the draft with his latest prospect watch, which was over Isaiah Jackson. Thanks again to Stephen for joining me here on the Spurscast, and to Michael De Leon for mixing and producing this episode. From all of us at Project Spurs, stay safe and have a great day.